The first case is Darlie Routier, a Texas mother. She lived in the Dallas suburb of Rolette. She was the mother of two young sons, Devin and Damon. On June 6, 1996, just after 2:30 in the morning, Routier called 911 from her home, reporting that an intruder had stabbed her two young sons and attacked her. Devin was 6 and Damon was 5. Both boys died from multiple stab wounds. Routier herself suffered a deep cut to her neck and wounds to her arms. She told police the attacker escaped through a cut window screen in the utility room. Investigators quickly turned their focus to Routier. Prosecutors argued she staged a break-in, pointing to broken glass, a cut screen, and a bloody sock found 75 yards from the house that contained blood from both boys. Forensic experts for the state testified that blood spatter on the back of Routier's nightshirt suggested she raised a knife over her head repeatedly. A crime scene consultant said the evidence fit a staged scene. The prosecution also cited family financial struggles and small insurance policies on the boys as possible motives, though the defense countered that those policies would not even cover funeral costs. But not all the evidence lined up neatly. The defense highlighted a bloody fingerprint at the scene that matched neither Routier nor her family, and raised questions about whether she could have inflicted her own wounds, staged the house, planted the sock so far away, and then called 911, all in the brief window before paramedics arrived. Medical experts disagreed on whether her injuries were self-inflicted, and ongoing appeals have centered on new DNA testing of evidence. Despite years of controversy and unresolved forensic questions, Darlie Routier remains under a death sentence in Texas, still fighting for a new trial. The next case is Melissa Lucio, a Texas mother from Brownsville. She was the mother of a 2-year-old daughter named Mariah, and she was pregnant with twins at the time. On February 17, 2007, Lucio's 2-year-old daughter Mariah was found unresponsive in their apartment. Hours after Mariah's death, Lucio was brought in by police for questioning. The interrogation began late at night and stretched over 5 hours, with Lucio exhausted, grieving, and physically drained. Texas Ranger Victor Escalon led much of the questioning, pressing Lucio to explain the child's bruising and injuries. According to the transcript, she said no 86 times and shook her head in denial 35 more. Officers refused to accept her answers, and they cycled through accusations and emotional appeals. By 3 a.m., after hours of relentless pressure, Lucio began to echo back statements suggested by investigators. She admitted to spanking and hitting, though her earlier statements and the available medical records pointed to Mariah's injuries coming from a fall down the stairs. The prosecution used this confession as their main evidence, arguing it showed intent and direct responsibility for Mariah's death. Defense experts and the American Psychological Association later warned that Lucio's confession bore all the hallmarks of coercion, including fatigue, trauma, and suggestibility, especially given her history of abuse and her low IQ. Despite these warnings and a lack of clear medical consensus on the cause of Mariah's injuries, Lucio was convicted and sentenced to death in 2008. Her case has since become a rallying point for advocates challenging police interrogation tactics and the reliability of confessions. Melissa Lucio remains on death row in Texas, and her case continues to be the subject of legal battles and public debate. The next case is Christy Scott, an Alabama mother from Russellville. She lived in Russellville with her husband and their children. Her 6-year-old son, Mason, was at the center of the tragedy. On the night of August 16, 2008, a fire broke out in Scott's home while her husband was away. Emergency crews arrived to find the house engulfed in flames. Mason was pulled from his bedroom but could not be revived. Investigators from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives examined the scene and determined the fire started in multiple locations, including Mason's room and the hallway, suggesting it had been set intentionally. Traces of accelerant were identified on carpet samples, supporting the arson theory. In the weeks before the fire, Scott had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Mason just days before his death. Prosecutors argued that this financial motive, combined with the fire science evidence, pointed directly to Scott. At trial, expert witnesses described burn patterns and accelerant traces, and insurance records showed the policy's recent purchase. Scott maintained her innocence, saying the fire was accidental and that she had tried to save her son. The defense said the scientific evidence was open to interpretation and that no one saw Scott set the fire. Despite her denials, the jury found her guilty of capital murder by arson. In 2009, Christy Scott was sentenced to death. Her conviction was upheld through multiple appeals, and the case continues to provoke debate over fire science and motive. She remains on death row in Alabama. The next case is Tierra Gobble, an Alabama mother from Dutton. She was living with her boyfriend and her 16-month-old son, Tyler. In November 2002, the child was found unresponsive in their home with bruises and head injuries. Medical examiners determined that Tyler died from blunt force trauma. Gobble claimed the injuries were accidental, saying the child fell from a couch, but investigators found that explanation inconsistent with the severity of the wounds. At trial, prosecutors struggled to present clear forensic evidence tying Gobble directly to the fatal injuries. Instead, they focused on motive and the circumstances inside the home. Testimony described a history of stress, young motherhood, and volatile relationships. The prosecution argued that Gobble's frustration with her son's crying and her unstable living situation led to a violent outburst. They cited patterns of previous injuries and statements from neighbors about loud arguments and disturbances. The defense called a psychologist during sentencing, who testified that Gobble was emotionally immature and overwhelmed, with a limited ability to cope and little support. Despite these mitigation claims, the jury found the aggravating circumstances outweighed them. In 2005, Gobble was sentenced to death for the murder of her son. She remains on death row in Alabama, and her case is cited in debates about the role of mental health and parental stress in capital sentencing. The next case is Socorro Cora Caro, a California mother who lived in Oxnard with her husband and 4 children. On November 22, 1999, Caro's home became the scene of a tragedy that stunned the community. 3 of her young children, ages 5, 8, and 11, were found shot to death in their beds. Her husband was also shot but survived. Caro herself was discovered with a gunshot wound to the head, which prosecutors argued was a failed suicide attempt. Language played a central role in Caro's case. Born in Mexico, Caro's primary language was Spanish, and she relied on court-appointed interpreters throughout her trial. Defense attorneys later argued that the interpretation provided was inconsistent and sometimes inaccurate, raising questions about whether Caro fully understood the charges, her rights, or the testimony against her. Appellate briefs cited several moments where Caro's responses in Spanish were mischaracterized in English, or where legal nuances were lost entirely. Court records show that at key points, Caro appeared confused or gave answers that did not align with the questions, fueling concerns about whether she could meaningfully participate in her own defense. The prosecution presented evidence of financial stress in the family and a history of marital conflict, but the jury's decision rested heavily on Caro's statements and her understanding of the proceedings. In 2002, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. While appeals have focused on interpreter reliability and the fairness of the trial, Caro remains on death row in California. Her case, a stark example of how language barriers can shape the outcome of justice. The next case is Manling Sang Williams, a California mother from Rowland Heights. On August 7, 2007, Williams killed her husband Neil and their 2 young sons, Devin and Ian, inside their family home. Neil was stabbed to death in the master bedroom. The boys, ages 7 and 3, were suffocated in their beds. Williams then drove to a nearby hotel, leaving the house to burn in an attempt to destroy evidence. Firefighters discovered the bodies after putting out the flames. These murders shocked the community. During the investigation, Williams confessed to the murders. She described feeling overwhelmed by depression and marital problems, and she told detectives she wanted to end her own life but could not leave her sons behind. At trial, her defense focused on her mental health. Clinical psychologists testified that Williams had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder and exhibited suicidal ideation, referencing the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual criteria and her history of self-harm. They argued that her actions were driven by psychological distress, not calculated malice. Prosecutors countered with evidence of premeditation. They pointed to Williams's internet searches about painless ways to die and her careful planning in staging the crime scene. The jury weighed the psychiatric testimony against the facts of the murders and the deliberate steps taken afterward. In 2010, Williams was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains on death row in California, and her case is often cited in debates about the role of mental illness as a mitigating factor in capital punishment. The next case is Lisa Graham, an Alabama mother from Phoenix City. She was the mother of a daughter named Stephanie, and the two had a troubled relationship. On July 5, 2007, Graham's daughter Stephanie was found shot to death on a remote roadside. The investigation quickly turned toward Lisa after police learned she had confided in a family friend about her problems with Stephanie. That friend agreed to act as a confidential informant and wore a recording device. On tape, Graham discussed wanting her daughter dead and asked for help arranging the killing. Prosecutors later played the recording in court, letting jurors hear Graham's own words outlining her intentions. Ballistics evidence provided a second layer of confirmation. The gun used in the shooting was traced back to Kenny Walton, a family acquaintance who later admitted to carrying out the crime at Graham's request. Forensic analysts matched bullets from the scene to Walton's firearm, and phone records placed Graham and Walton in contact before and after Stephanie's death. During trial, prosecutors emphasized both the recording and the physical evidence, arguing that Graham orchestrated the murder out of anger and frustration with her daughter's behavior. Lisa Graham was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 2015. Her legal team has raised questions about the fairness of the investigation and her mental health, but the conviction has held through appeals. She remains under a death sentence in Alabama, housed on death row at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. The next case is Linda Carty, a British-born mother living in Houston, Texas. On May 16, 2001, Carty was accused of orchestrating a kidnapping that ended with the murder of 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez. Prosecutors said Carty, desperate to keep her common-law partner from leaving, plotted to steal Rodriguez's newborn son. According to testimony, Carty enlisted 3 men, Gerald Anderson, Chris Robinson, and Carlos Williams, to break into Rodriguez's apartment, bind her and her husband, and take the baby. Rodriguez was found dead in the trunk of a car, suffocated with a plastic bag. The infant survived and was discovered unharmed. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the statements of the 3 men, all of whom testified against Carty in exchange for plea deals that spared them the death penalty. Each man claimed Carty was the mastermind who planned the abduction and provided the tools. No physical evidence directly tied Carty to the scene, but the testimony of her co-defendants proved decisive. Carty's defense later argued that her court-appointed attorney failed to challenge these witnesses or present evidence that could have cast doubt on their motives or credibility. Independent legal reviews have criticized the quality of her defense, noting missed opportunities to cross-examine the cooperating witnesses or investigate their backgrounds. In 2002, a Harris County jury found Carty guilty of capital murder and sentenced her to death. Her case has drawn international attention, with appeals focused on claims of ineffective counsel and questions about whether the prosecution's reliance on plea-bargained testimony led to an unfair trial. Despite growing calls for a new hearing, Linda Carty remains on death row in Texas. The next case is Kimberly Cargill, a mother from White House, Texas. Kimberly Cargill lived in White House, Texas. She was a mother in her community and had a history of conflicts with neighbors and relatives. On June 18, 2010, Cargill was arrested for the murder of Cherry Walker, a woman she had known for years. Walker, who was intellectually disabled, had been subpoenaed to testify in a custody hearing involving Cargill and Child Protective Services. Just before Walker was scheduled to appear in court, her burned body was discovered on the side of a rural road in Smith County. Investigators traced the crime back to Cargill, who had picked Walker up from her home that evening. During the trial, the prosecution focused on Cargill's pattern of violent behavior and repeated threats against people she saw as obstacles. A forensic pathologist testified that Walker died from asphyxiation before her body was set on fire. Evidence showed Cargill had attempted to clean her car and dispose of incriminating items after the crime. The state called a violence propensity expert who outlined Cargill's history of aggression, including prior assaults and documented threats. Jurors heard testimony that Cargill had choked a relative and threatened to harm others who disagreed with her. The prosecution argued that Cargill represented a continuing danger to society, a key element in Texas capital sentencing. At the penalty phase, Texas law required the jury to decide whether Cargill would pose a future threat if not executed, and whether there were mitigating circumstances that would justify sparing her life. The jury found that she remained a danger and that no sufficient mitigation existed. In 2012, Kimberly Cargill received a death sentence. She remains on death row in Texas, and her case is often cited as an example of how Texas juries weigh future dangerousness in capital cases. The next case is Tina LaSonia Brown, a mother from Century, Florida. On March 24, 2010, Brown and two others drove to the home of 19-year-old Kayla Etheridge. Prosecutors say Brown targeted Etheridge over a personal dispute, and the group forced Etheridge into a car, beat her, and drove her to a remote area. There, Etheridge was doused with gasoline and set on fire. She died from her injuries after several days in the hospital, and she named Brown as one of her attackers in her final statements to police. Gasoline. Brown was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At trial, the prosecution relied on Etheridge's dying declaration, physical evidence of gasoline residue, and testimony from Brown's co-defendants. The jury found Brown guilty and recommended a death sentence. In 2012, the court imposed the death penalty, but the case did not end there. Trial. Florida's death penalty laws changed after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Hearst, which required unanimous jury recommendations for death. Brown's sentence was briefly vacated because of those legal changes, but in 2017, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed the trial record and the jury instructions and reinstated her death sentence. The case drew attention to evolving legal rules and the limits of jury instructions in capital cases. Hearst. She remains on death row in Florida. Today, more than 50 women sit on death row in the United States, many of them mothers. Their stories force us to confront the dark intersections of parenthood, violence, and justice. As executions and appeals continue, the debate over the death penalty's place in modern America only grows sharper. Should any of these women be granted mercy, or is death the only answer? Tell us what you think.